All right. I'll take advantage of the hush. Welcome, everyone. My name is Beck Nelson. I'm the Director of the Melbourne Centre for Law and the Environment, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Fergus Green here for this seminar. So I'll start off by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Fergus is joining us today. He's an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy at University College London. He's also an Honorary Senior Fellow at the Melbourne Law School and is at the tail end of an intensive teaching experience. So we are particularly grateful to have his time at this point. His research seeks to understand the role of politics, governance and law in both causing and responding to climate change, with a particular focus on fossil fuels. As well as publishing in leading academic journals, Fergus was a contributing author to 3 editions of the United Nations Environment Programme's Fossil Fuel Production Gap Report. He's also supported NGOs in multiple jurisdictions in fossil fuel-related climate litigation, including as a member of the Melbourne Climate Futures team quite recently, which appeared as amicus curiae in the High Court appeal of Mac Energy and Denman. Before he became an academic, Fergus was a lawyer in Melbourne and subsequently a policy analyst and research advisor to Professor Nicholas Stern at the London School of Economics. He is also a friend to MCLE and a repeat visitor, and we hope that those repeat visits continue in the future. While Fergus is getting his slides sorted out, I'll just note that this seminar is being recorded. We will circulate a link to the recording of the seminar, and we have people joining us online as well as in the room. So welcome everyone, and over to you, Fergus.
Thanks, Beck. Looks like BYO technology has carried the day. So we are team effort. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm looking forward to kind of sharing this work that I've recently done with Francis Medlock for the Australia Institute. And so the report is basically the same name as the title you see there, and I'm going to be talking sort of largely to that today. So the headline finding from the report is that the safeguard mechanism is failing to drive down emissions in Australia's biggest polluting industries because it allows companies to use so-called offsets to an unlimited amount instead of reducing their own emissions. The carbon credits that are used as offsets are not capable of undoing the harm to the climate system caused by fossil fuel emissions, and many, probably the large majority, do not represent real or additional abatement at all. And the fossil fuel industry is the biggest beneficiary of these arrangements. This poses international legal and reputational risks for Australia that I'll touch on, and the scheme urgently needs to be reformed. That is essentially what I'm going to talk about, or each of those things today. So let me start by explaining what the safeguard mechanism is. Well, the safeguard mechanism is Australia's flagship climate policy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions at Australia's most highly polluting industrial facilities outside of the electricity sector, at least the grid-connected electricity sector. And so that's largely a lot of fossil fuel producers, so coal mines, gas extraction, gas processing, LNG production, right? That's more than half the emissions covered by the scheme. And the rest is largely other mining and large manufacturing, things like steel, aluminium, cement, and cement. So the safeguard mechanism has, one might think, an inauspicious history. An earlier version was introduced by the Abbott government in 2015, 2016. But I think to sort of understand where it's come from, it's helpful to go back just slightly further to, by the looks of this audience, an era where we will all remember all too painfully well, and that is, well, at least painfully in terms of how it ended, the Gillard carbon price, which was, of course, enacted and in effect from 2012 to 2014, which required more or less many of the country's largest polluters to pay a price per tonne of every emission, every tonne of emissions. And it's worth mentioning that alongside the carbon pricing mechanism, the Gillard government created something called the Carbon Farming Initiative, which for sectors that were outside the carbon pricing mechanism, like agriculture and the land sector and some landfills, instead of making them pay for every tonne of emissions, the Carbon Farming Initiative allowed them to get credits, so basically to make money from reducing emissions or removing carbon from the atmosphere. And there was basically a mechanism whereby companies that had to pay the carbon price could, at least initially for a portion of their liability, buy offsets, credits, through the Carbon Farming Initiative. Now, the reason that matters is because, as we all know, in 2014, the Abbott government repealed the carbon pricing mechanism, but this left a lot of farmers and landowners without their main demand source for their credits. And so the Abbott government basically did two things. It created a government fund called the Emissions Reduction Fund to buy some of those credits directly from landowners and others who had projects that were under the Carbon Farming Initiative. And it also created something called the Safeguard Mechanism, version 1.0, which essentially was sort of part of the negotiations with the crossbench, who were worried, okay, fine, you're going to buy some credits over here, but what if the big industrial polluters increase their emissions over there? So in order to get the carbon pricing repeal passed, they agreed, okay, we'll create this thing called the Safeguard Mechanism. And basically it kind of wasn't very effective. It sort of put some very, very loose caps on emissions from large industrial facilities, and is widely regarded as not really doing much to reduce emissions in those sectors. But it was on the books and it was operational. And then fast forward to 2022, the federal election campaign, and you had a Labor Party that wanted to look more green than the coalition, but did not want to relaunch the so-called climate wars and take a more ambitious scheme to the electorate. So to kind of achieve those two things, they said, okay, well, we'll just take the government's safeguard mechanism and make it a bit better. And so that was basically their approach. And in 2023, after being elected, they passed reforms to the safeguard mechanism to, at least in their eyes, improve the scheme. So that's the history of it. And I'll certainly be talking from now on only about the reformed scheme, which has been operating since 1 July 2023. So when I refer to the scheme, that's what I mean. So how does it work? Okay, so bear with me. It's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, and hopefully it'll be clear. So first thing to note, the scheme applies to facilities. What's a facility? More or less a kind of large industrial site. So like an aluminium smelter or a coal mine or an LNG facility. And it applies to facilities that emit more than 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. What does that mean? Well, that's quite a lot. It basically means it captures about a bit over 200 of Australia's largest facilities. And it covers about 30% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, each facility gets something called a baseline each year. And a baseline is kind of a cap or limit of sorts on its annual emissions, its direct emissions. And the operator of the facility has to basically keep its emissions below the baseline on pain of penalty if it goes above the baseline, which is meant to provide an incentive to reduce emissions because the baselines tighten each year. So the baselines now go down each year, which is meant to provide a gradually ratcheting incentive to reduce emissions. But there is a get out of jail cheaply clause, which says that if you operate your facility such that your emissions are higher than your baseline in a given year, well, you can you can just buy an unlimited amount of so-called offsets to reduce your net emissions back to your baseline. So that's basically how it works. And I'll explain what offsets are and so on, and some of the problems with them in a moment, a little bit later on. So that's how the scheme kind of operates. What I will do now is talk about what's the scheme achieved, the sort of headline aggregate data. So we've got 2 years of data on the reformed scheme now, and I'm going to be talking about the most recent year for which we have data. So that's the 2024-25 financial year. And the figures that I'll give you are from the Clean Energy Regulator that regulates the scheme, based on all the aggregate data from all of the facilities that are covered by the scheme. So there are 2 relevant metrics: gross emissions and net emissions. Gross emissions, where you don't count offsets, it's just the emissions from the facilities that are in the scheme. So in the last financial year, gross emissions fell 2.3% compared to the previous year. So the government says, yes, great, look, the scheme's reducing emissions, or emissions are falling, actual emissions are falling. Problem is, the Climate Change Authority, the government's independent climate change advisory body, said that, yeah, well, yes, gross emissions fell, but not really because of the scheme. It kind of fell for coincidental reasons, temporary closures of facilities due to industrial, accidents and so on, sort of changes in production that have nothing to do with decarbonisation, some permanent closures of facilities. So, and the Climate Change Authority says, once you kind of factor in all of those things that have nothing to do with the scheme or to do with decarbonisation, emissions across the rest of the facilities were steady. So that's why we choose our words carefully, and we say the scheme is not driving emissions reductions, because those reductions are not being driven by the scheme. Then we have the other figure, the net emissions reduction figure, and the government will make much and has made much of the fact that net emissions fell 5.5% year on year. But our argument is that net emissions reductions is basically a meaningless concept. It is net emissions reductions on paper. It is an accounting reduction, but because offsets bear little to no relation to the underlying physical reality of emissions going into the atmosphere or carbon being stored, then those numbers are largely illusory. So what you have overall is companies that are largely just buying offsets in order to comply, rather than reducing on-site emissions. And before I come to an example of that, I'll just show you this slide from the government. And basically what it shows is, it's slightly confusing because it says green is gross. Gross emissions are like the whole of each bar, and net emissions are just the orange ones. And so you can see the difference there. So net emissions are coming down, which is the illusory number. And gross emissions are going down a little bit, right? But like I said, the Climate Change Authority says that really has nothing to do with the scheme. So that's basically the picture. So as I said, companies are really, if they're above their baselines, then they're largely opting to buy offsets to comply, rather than reducing on-site emissions, because offsets tend to be cheap, and we'll explore why a little bit later. And I think a really powerful example of this that I'm sure many of you will be familiar is the recent BHP files that were reported on by The Guardian and ABC, which basically showed that BHP had, announced grand plans to achieve net zero emissions, including to electrify its large haulage trucks and trains in its iron ore operations in the Pilbara, and to power those with new on-site renewable energy. but it kind of quietly shelved those projects when management sort of decided that, basically, I guess the economics didn't stack up. Well, that is precisely the kind of on-site decarbonisation that the safeguard mechanism should be incentivising. But in order to comply with the safeguard mechanism, the 6 BHP iron ore facilities that are in the Pilbara, that were covered by the safeguard mechanism, were in total over their baselines, and they just used offsets to comply at a cost of about estimated cost of about $8 million last year. At the same time, for BHP's Pilbara operations, it was reported that currently these trucks and trains use diesel, which is obviously causing a lot of emissions, and but they received $322 million in fuel tax rebates from the government's fuel tax credit scheme. So, as I explained this to my students the other day, it's like encouraging fossil fuel use with a sledgehammer and regulating carbon with a feather. So if you were a conspiracy theorist, you might think that the scheme has been designed to basically not encourage decarbonisation and instead just as kind of a boon for the carbon credit industry. Well, you wouldn't be a conspiracy theorist, because Labor MP Dan Reputational said the quiet part out loud. And certainly as far as the safeguard mechanism is concerned, it is indeed all about offsets. So we'd better hope that these offsets are actually offsetting the climate impact of the fossil fuels that are not being abated. Well, spoiler alert, most of them at least are probably not. So what are the problems with offsets? Well, first, before I get to that, I'll just explain kind of what is a carbon credit and the distinction between a carbon credit and an offset. So a carbon credit is basically where somebody pays the owner of land or some other kind of facility to reduce emissions, avoid emissions, or remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so they're basically getting paid to do, or they're getting credits for doing something good, right, purportedly. And each credit is worth, nominally, its face value is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so usually what happens, and these schemes exist all over the world, is that somebody has a bright idea about how they can, remove carbon or avoid emissions, and they'll go to the scheme and they'll register their project, and then they'll have some auditing done, and it'll show that they've removed carbon and reduced emissions, and then the crediting body will issue them with a number of credits equivalent to the amount that's been avoided or removed. And then they'll be able to sell those credits. And, for a long time, they could sell them to companies like Qantas, and you could offset your flights and things like that. But now, because of the safeguard mechanism and all of the liable entities under the safeguard mechanism can use those credits, they're the main buyers of the credits. And I should say that kind of if it's just a credit, if it doesn't work very well, that's kind of too bad, but it's not the end of the world. So for instance, if I've got a project and I'm planting some trees, and I say that I've stored 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and I go to the regulator and get 100,000 credits, but it turns out actually I've only stored 5,000. And if it's just a credit, and say the government was buying it, well, the government's probably wasted a bit of money, but the atmosphere is at least 5,000 tonnes sort of better off. The problem comes when that credit is sold as an offset and used to offset actual real-world emissions. And in the safeguard mechanism, that's what happens. So if I take my 100,000 credits that I've got from planting the trees, and I sell them to BHP, and it's, in lieu of its for all its diesel emissions. Well, BHP's emitted 100,000 tonnes, but actually my trees have only soaked up 5,000, so the atmosphere is 95,000 tonnes worse. So actually the distinction between a credit and an offset is fundamental. It's when it becomes an offset that it really has to be 100% equivalent to the fossil fuel emissions. And this, as we'll see, is where we run into problems. So there are broadly two kinds of credits. There are avoidance credits and removal credits, and both of these are exist under Australia's scheme. But just sort of talking in general terms, avoidance credits are where you basically say, well, I'm doing something that is going to emit a lower amount of emissions than would otherwise have happened. And the bit that I'm avoiding, that's the bit that gets credited. So, for instance, I could say, I've got all these trees here and I was going to cut them down and I was entitled to cut them down, but I'm not going to do that. And so I've avoided those emissions. Or you can get removal credits if you're removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that's the tree planting example would be an example of that. We could say, okay, I'm going to plant a bunch of trees that are going to soak up carbon and store it. Now, the fundamental problem, there are two fundamental problems or there's one fundamental problem with each of these types of credits. The fundamental problem with avoidance credits is that they don't halt the accumulation, when used as offsets, I should say, is that they don't halt the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So you get the emissions from the emitting activity, and the atmosphere doesn't know what wouldn't have happened. It just sees what did happen. And so experts, recommend that we shouldn't actually use avoidance credits as offsets, but we do. And then with removal credits, the fundamental problem there, and almost all of the removal credits that have ever been issued are for vegetation-based removals, trees and soils. The fundamental problem there is that at best, if all goes well, vegetation can only store carbon for up to about 100 years and often less. Whereas when you burn fossil fuels, a large portion of the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, like around 40%, stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So there's just a fundamental temporal mismatch there, but we call those things the same. So, and then that's before we even get into problems of whether the offsets, the credits actually do what they say they'll do, which I'll come to in a second. So, so they're the kind of general types of offsets, and both of those are the kind of offsets that can generate, kind of projects that can generate what are called Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs. And ACCUs are one of the two types of offsets that can be used under the safeguard mechanism. The other's called Safeguard Mechanism Credits, or SMCs, and I'll come to that in a little bit. So turning now to the kind of ACCUs that are being used in Australia, and ACCUs have been generated, as I said earlier, since the days of the Carbon Farming Initiative through the Abbott Government's Emissions Reduction Fund. So there are a lot of ACCUs in the system now. They've been around for a while, and they've also, these projects have been able to be studied by experts empirically. So we have a lot of information about ACCUs, much more than we do about the last 2 years of the safeguard mechanism. And basically the vast majority of credits that have been issued to date have been issued from three families of methods. Avoided deforestation, so that's not cutting down trees, not clearing land that you say that you otherwise would have. Human-induced regeneration of native forest, which is basically like changing land management practices, maybe reducing grazing, for instance, and thereby allowing native forests to regenerate. And landfill gas, which is essentially landfills produce like biogenic methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, but you can kind of capture the methane and pipe it, and you can get credits for either flaring the methane, which still reduces CO2, but it's less potent than just venting the methane, or for turning that captured methane and using it to generate electricity. And so how have those credits fared? Well, essentially, the expert assessments are that 90% of avoided deforestation credits, 90% of human-induced regeneration credits, and 30% of landfill gas credits do not represent real or additional abatement at all. And to quote Professor Andrew McIntosh from ANU Law School, who was the chair of the Offset Methods Integrity Committee for 6.5 years, quote, "People are getting accused for not clearing forests that were never going to be cleared, for growing trees that are already there, for growing forests in places that will never sustain permanent forests, and for operating electricity generators at large landfills that would have operated anyway. What is occurring is a fraud on the environment, a fraud on taxpayers, and a fraud on unwitting private buyers of ACCUs," end quote. So they're the main type of offset that's being used to offset actual emissions under the safeguard mechanism. And I think this quote kind of captures the problems with offsets, and this is from a agreed statement as part of a settlement for greenwashing litigation against Energy Australia, Australia's third largest emitter. And they acknowledged that as part of their settlement that offsets do not undo the harms caused by burning fossil fuels. And I commend the whole settlement statement, actually. It's very good. So that's ACCUs. Then we have SMCs, Safeguard Mechanism credits. So what's an SMC? So these are credits. So whereas ACCUs are generated outside of the Safeguard Mechanism facilities, right? So, Safeguard Mechanism credits, as the name suggests, are generated from within the Safeguard Mechanism. And so remember I said earlier that if your covered emissions are above your baseline, then you can use offsets to bring them below. Well, if your covered emissions are below your baseline, then the government will issue you with Safeguard Mechanism credits for the difference. So if your baseline is 100,000 or, say 1 million tonnes in 1 year, and your emissions are actually 900,000 tonnes, well, then the regulator will issue you with 100,000 SMCs, and you can bank those for use in later years, or you can sell them to entities who operate facilities that are over their baselines. Now, the problem with SMCs is that the way that baselines are set is essentially arbitrary. It's not completely random. There's a formula and so on, but basically the parameters that go into the formula are kind of essentially arbitrary. We can talk in the Q&A if you're interested about how baselines are set, but broadly speaking, they're somewhat arbitrary. And so a lot of facilities are just emitting below their baseline without having done any decarbonisation, just kind of almost by dint of luck or geography. And there's one particularly egregious and significant example of this that's recently got some press. So that's Shell's Prelude LNG facility off the coast of Western Australia. You can see it's extremely big by reference to the other boats around it. But that's sort of neither here nor there. So basically, this was reported a few weeks ago, coincidentally, actually, genuinely coincidentally, on the day that we launched our report, which was sort of helpful. Some reporting in the Fin Review based on some underlying research that Tim Baxter has done, which showed that 1 in 6 of the Safeguard Mechanism credits that have been issued so far by the regulator have gone to Shell's Prelude facility. And basically, Shell's Prelude facility is operating under its baseline because the way its baseline was set was just sort of so ridiculous that it was wildly inflated. Essentially, it was based on its historical emissions intensity, and in the first few years of startup of the facility, there were a bunch of critical safety incidents that meant production had to be shut down, but the gas was still coming out, and all of the gas went to flare. And then they were also had some gas already being stored on the facility at LNG, which has to be cooled at negative 160 degrees or something. So that takes a lot of emissions. So they weren't producing, but they had a lot of emissions for a few years. And so its emissions intensity was really high, and emissions intensity is sort of the main parameter in the baseline. So when its production levels normalized and its emissions intensity fell, but it had this ridiculously high baseline. And so basically, because of a bunch of critical safety incidents, its emissions were way below its baseline. And so 1 in 6 of the SMCs that have been issued so far, $90 million worth of SMCs, have gone to Shell. And Tim estimates that even as the baselines go down, in the next few years, it's still going to be so much lower than its baseline that it's going to ultimately get $200 million worth of SMCs. So that's one example, and it's not even an isolated example. There are a lot of coal mines that have generated SMCs just because they happen to be kind of less gassy than the industry average, just because of geography. So they've got kind of hot air SMCs as well. So I think examples like this are highly embarrassing to the scheme in general and SMCs in particular. So yeah, so they're the offsets that companies can use for compliance. And the next point is really that the fossil fuel industry is really the biggest beneficiary of all of this. So more than 2/3 of the offsets surrendered for compliance purposes since 2023 were from fossil fuel companies. And fossil fuel sectors are the most dependent on offsets for compliance. And by that I mean offsets represent the highest proportion of their covered emissions. And so this is sort of each of the 3 bars is sort of the different years of the scheme, the last 3 years of the scheme, and these are different sort of fossil fuel sectors. So basically, so you can read that as like, so if you look at the coal mining one and the red one, 20% of the emissions from all of the coal mines in the scheme are being basically addressed through offsets. And then you've got sort of, pipelines and petroleum, and then oil and gas as well. And many of these fossil fuel companies are actually increasing their emissions, and you can do that under the scheme. You might just need to buy a few more ACCUs. Or if you're increasing emissions because you're increasing production, well, actually you might not, because it's just an emissions intensity scheme. So if your production goes up, actually your baseline will proportionally go up as well. So many fossil fuel companies are increasing emissions, and the scheme has also not stopped new coal and gas expansions. And since the Albanese government has been in power, there have been 36 approvals of new or expanded or extended coal and gas projects. So this is all going quite well for the fossil fuel industry, and perhaps we can talk later a little bit about what, kind of how that's happening, those expansions. So finally, really, just in terms of the implications, so I think that this does pose some international, legal and reputational risks for Australia, although, I also wouldn't want to overstate those. Like, I don't think these are going to be the primary things that are driving the Australian government's decision-making about the scheme. Nonetheless, they're non-trivial as well. So, and I'll just make a few quick points here and then maybe open up for Q&A. So the first point is really just about our unlimited use of offsets. And so it's basically, we say this in the report, that Australia is one of a small handful of jurisdictions that has an emissions trading scheme of some form that allows unlimited use of offsets. A small handful of jurisdictions, including Kazakhstan. So, we're not exactly doing best practice carbon markets. The second one, many of you will recognise that, is, of course, the Chamber for the International Court of Justice. And, I'm sure many in this room already know this, and I won't go into it in great detail, but obviously the International Court of Justice last year handed down a landmark unanimous advisory opinion on states' responsibilities for climate change under international law. And, it basically says, countries need to be have a stringent due diligence obligation. They should be, their climate policies should represent their highest possible ambition. And I think it's pretty hard to argue that the safeguard mechanism represents Australia's highest possible ambition. And we also have a customary international law duty not to cause significant harm to the climate system, including from fossil fuel production, while we're massively expanding fossil fuel production, and the safeguard mechanism is failing to stop that. And then the third point, and is Australia signed on to the Belém Declaration at COP30 last year, which commits it to transitioning away from fossil fuels. Now, it's not a binding treaty, but it's a declaration that Australia signed up to transition away from fossil fuels when it's transitioning towards fossil fuels. And given that Chris Bowen will be leading president of the COP negotiations this year, spotlight will be on Australia more than usual. And so I think some of the problems, particularly with its fossil fuel expansion, potentially also its safeguard mechanism as well, being more in the spotlight, will lead to some at least reputational risk for Australia. So look, in my view, the scheme needs to be or urgently reformed. We focus in our kind of discussions and advocacy more on the problems, and we don't really call for reform specifically, not because we don't, not for lack of ideas about how to reform it. I mean, the main thing we call for is basically just severing offsets from the scheme, so not allowing offsets for compliance. And that would be actually, if they did nothing else, the government's reviewing the scheme as of any moment now. And if they did nothing else, that would actually be a significant improvement, because then the caps, the baselines would ratchet down, but that would actually provide a gradually strengthening incentive to reduce on-site emissions. So that's one small thing that they could do that would actually make a big difference. Certainly, if you were designing climate policy from scratch, you wouldn't do this. You would do something completely different, and I'm sure we all have plenty of ideas of what one could do, and we could maybe get into those in the Q&A. But just to sort of kind of maybe finally a strategy point, so, release this report with the Australia Institute, and, our approach has really been to try and sort of set the agenda and focus on the problems so that the heat is on the government. And there can be a tendency, I think, sometimes to be like, oh, what's the solutions? Or let's come up with our own detailed solutions. The danger with that is that then the government can, or opponents can just focus on your solutions and pick problems with your solutions. And we're trying to sort of keep the heat on the government. And so we're really focusing on the problems. And if people want to talk to us about solutions, we've got plenty of ideas. But at the moment, it's really about trying to generate pressure on the government to show that the scheme's not working, and something needs to be done about it. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. That's the report if you want to take a look.
Great. Thank you so much, Fergus. And I think in a year that is just replete with so many inquiries and investigations in areas of environmental law and natural resources law more generally, this sort of critique is so important. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. All right. Well, I've been mentally sifting Fergus's comments to find something positive. I'm not having a lot of luck there.
The government's reviewing the scheme, so there's an opportunity to influence it.
Fantastic.
So if you think this is outrageous, then write a submission and say this is outrageous and it has to change. That is the answer to Ray's question, right? The more people who know about this and know how ridiculous it is, hopefully you might exercise your voice and have some input at a time when the government is going to review the scheme. And let's see what happens.
Excellent note to end on. All right, everyone, please join me in thanking Fergus once again.